Hi, I'm the host of Education Beat, Zadie Stavely. This week, we're bringing you a repeat episode about a student who's the lead plaintiff in a lawsuit that claims that California illegally favors wealthy school districts when distributing funding to repair and renovate school buildings. The Alameda County Superior Court held a hearing this week to decide whether to freeze more than $3 billion of state funding to modernize schools until the case is heard and a verdict is issued. If the judge agrees to freeze the funds, that could pressure Governor Gavin Newsom to settle the case and reform the way renovation funding is distributed. If the judge denies the injunction, then the state will continue to grant building assistance as usual while the lawsuit drags on. At the time we produced this episode, a decision had not yet been made. Either way, the lawsuit continues. In this episode, you'll hear why the plaintiffs filed the lawsuit in the first place. Miliani Rodriguez is a senior at Coachella Valley High School. The school buildings are old, she says, and they show it.
It gets to sometimes close to 120 degrees, and the ACs constantly get broken.
When it rains, the ceilings leak.
We had 2 buckets. One was right next to me, just catching all the water that was dripping from the ceiling.
And this school year in her ceramics class, the sinks broke.
And over the weekend, it was just flooding the classroom. And we had to move classrooms because the floors are wet and the tiles were lifting. So we couldn't work on our projects. And it took about almost a week for it to get fixed.
Miliani thought these kinds of things were normal. She's attended school in the Coachella Valley Unified School District since kindergarten. And as long as she can remember, she's gone to run-down schools. But last year, she visited her cousin's high school, Indio High, just a couple of miles away.
The buildings were just very modernized. They're really tall. We don't have those glass buildings that they do. Everything was very large and spacious. The track was very large. Their gym was pretty big. They had working AC, the restrooms as well. Everything was so fresh. And compared to our school, it's like you walk in there and it feels humid. And it was just a big difference. It just looked like a college campus.
That's when Miliani had a realization.
That we can have change at our school. Our school can have that as well, but we just had to fight for it.
This is Education Beat, getting to the heart of California schools. This week, California is sued by students, teachers, and others over run-down school buildings in poor districts. Miliani Rodriguez is now the lead plaintiff in a lawsuit, Miliani R versus State of California, which claims the way the state subsidizes school renovations perpetuates vast inequalities for students, sending more money to the districts that already have more property wealth and locking out poor districts from accessing the funding. My colleague John Fensterwald has been covering this issue for EdSource for years, and he wrote about the lawsuit. Hi, John.
Hey, Zadie.
So at the heart of this lawsuit is the state's formula for facility funding. How does that formula work?
Yes, this lawsuit particularly focuses on modernization, upgrade, renovations, and the state facility program works with a 60-40% match. The state will pay 60%, districts put up 40% for projects that meet the state's approval.
Okay, and what's the problem with that?
The problem with it, threefold. And one is it's a match regardless of need. And I say by need, there's both student need of the students who live in the districts, but particularly it's need based on property taxes. Their districts have less property wealth, which often coincide in districts with the most Black, Latino students, but there's less property wealth to tax compared with high wealth districts that have lots of property, and therefore you can A, produce bigger bonds, and B, you actually can have a lower tax rate because you're spreading the taxes over a larger tax base. And that's the second reason. So, you can have districts with the same bond size, say a $90 million bond, but if you're a wealthy district, you have a lower tax rate than you would if you're a property poor, often poor district. And the third thing is it's a first come, first serve. And so that usually advantages wealthy districts that have the money to hire consultants and get in line first. So what happens is by the time you apply, there's no money left in the bond. You go on a waiting list for the next bond, which could be 5, 10 years away.
How big of a gap is there between districts?
The Center for Cities and Schools looked at every district in the state, and they looked at how much property wealth per student there is, and then they compared them. And it could be a tenfold difference between, say, in the lowest property tax per student, it's around $10,000, and then you get districts that are $100,000 per student. They also measured how much did districts get in assistance from the state. Over the last 25 years, turns out the wealthier districts, the districts that have the most property per student, they got 2.5 times the amount of state aid as the lowest funded districts.
In addition to Miliani, who are the other plaintiffs, John?
Besides Miliani, there are individuals, there are parents, a couple of teachers, organizations that represent parents, and they represent districts such as Salinas City Elementary District and Linwood Unified and outside of LA, San Bernardino, also districts up north, Del Norte. There are about 17 individuals, and they represent about 9 districts.
And what are some of the conditions that plaintiffs shared in the lawsuit?
They share really buildings in terrible shape, buildings that leak all the time in the winter, and there are districts without air conditioning or malfunctioning air conditioning. And there are districts without shade outside, and also not enough room, for example, to eat. So then they have to go outside, and then there's no place to stand in the heat in the summer and when it rains in the winter. There are districts with poor wiring and connectivity for internet. There are districts with terrible athletic conditions, tracks that are cracked and playgrounds that are dangerous, and districts that are cramped, portables that are out of date, often 70 years old. There's not enough room. They're crowded. Basically, it's a full range from districts that have not been able to or have not kept up with regular maintenance that over the decades mounts up, so that every time they'd issue a bond, it's not to build new buildings, it's not to extensively replace portables, but to patch them up. So you can't even apply to get the state match because you just can't afford it with your bond.
John, what stood out to you when you spoke with teachers and principals and students?
I had a chance to go to Salinas City Elementary District, and I spoke with the superintendent who was pointing out that, that's the salad bowl of the nation, and yet their kitchens are so small, basically they just warm up processed food, and they can't cook their own vegetables, which they would like to do. All these vegetables are grown within a stone's throw of the schools, and yet the facilities don't allow it. And then I took a tour of a 100-year-old school called Lincoln, and from the outside it looks like a classic 100-year-old school. It looks beautiful from the outside, and then you go in, and I wanted to see a couple portables, and they took me to a third grade classroom of Raul Leon, who actually turned out to be a plaintiff in this case. And he said, "Sure, here, let me show you." And he showed me his walls that, in fact, it rained last winter, and it's still, until recently, wet. And he showed me pictures of the rotten timbers behind that wall, and also the material for insulation that were, instead of being pink, it was black. And that's black mold. And that is very unhealthy to breathe. And no one wants to be in a room with black mold.
These conditions also affect learning. Miliani says it's hard to concentrate when you're in a classroom with 100-degree weather and no AC.
It just drains you. You're just tired at school. I don't know if you've ever had that feeling of being drained from the heat. Like, that's how it feels, like, in school, in your classroom. That's how it feels, like, all day. You're just, like, waiting for the bell to ring so that way you can go to the next class with maybe better AC or just the bells ring to go home.
Growing up, Miliani got so used to the conditions at her schools that she believed she and her classmates shouldn't expect more because they lived in a low-income district.
It was like, oh, this is normal. Like, oh, well, we're not going to be able to afford that. Our school is broke. Our district is broke. Like, that's all you hear from the students here. So it's almost like you kind of give up after a while. You feel like it can't change.
And it's not just the students who start to think that rundown schools are all they deserve. John, one thing that really stood out to me from your article is that you spoke with a superintendent who's worked in both a poor district and a wealthier district.
Yes, Sadie. Actually, I went to visit Goodiel Cross-State in Sunnyvale to talk with him about his experience. It was an interesting interview because up until this fall, Superintendent Crosswaite was the superintendent of Linwood Unified, which is one of the property poorest districts in the state. And it's near LA. It was affected by redlining, in other words, zoning that caused discrimination. And it's one of the poorest in terms of something like $9,000 per student compared with Sunnyvale, which is where he is now, which is like $110,000 per student. And he was so used to the conditions in Linwood that he was really in awe when he went to Sunnyvale and he noticed these schools.
Going into the spaces and having matching furniture, having the technology in place, the grounds outdoors with trees and grass and spaces for the kids to relax in the shade. In Linwood, the challenges are we don't have adequate green space. We don't have really space for like shaded areas. My kids over there didn't even have indoor eating areas. So when it rained or we had bad weather, they're trying to find shade anywhere they can or covering anywhere they can. And that's just the norm there because it's always been like that. But it's not normal. And of course, our schools here in Sunnyvale look nice and clean. They've been recently painted. And over there in Linwood, you have to choose, do I do HVAC? Do I do the plumbing? Do I do the roofs? And aside from that is the aesthetics of the schools, right? So it also sends a message about what we believe in our kids. And I can tell you as an adult working in the system, as a superintendent, et cetera, I also internalized like this belief, this messaging that we see through our facilities that we are less than, right? We are not as valuable or is not as important as kids in communities that may have these inspiring, amazing athletic or academic environments that says to them, we believe in you. This is how much we believe in you that we have created these amazing spaces for you as well.
John, what has the state of California said in response to the lawsuit?
Well, there's been no comment immediately from the state agencies that were named in the suit, the State Allocations Board and the Office of Public School Construction and the Department of Education. The state has not taken a position, but two governors have. Jerry Brown refused to endorse a bond in 2016 because he didn't like the formula. He didn't like the first come, first serve. He didn't like bonds, period, but particularly the conditions of this. And then Governor Newsom in the 2020 bond, which failed, he at the last minute tried to negotiate changes to this formula. There were sort of modest changes at most. Interestingly enough, it would have ended first come, first serve, but voters defeated that bond, not because of that reason. It was proposed during the early months of COVID. But then in this current bond negotiated by the legislature, Prop 2 that we passed only last November, that had some modest changes, but otherwise basically kept the system intact. Under this bond, the poorest districts and those districts with the poorest kids get a couple extra percentage match. You can get up to 65% instead of just 60%. But I think those people who have looked at it, certainly public advocates and Center for Cities and Schools, said that's not enough to make a difference. Because as long as you're going to keep the 60% match as a minimum, you're going to require huge bonds to make them equitable. And the state so far hasn't provided any kind of money of that magnitude.
You mentioned in your article that one thing that's changed over time is that now there's more data to support the fact that this funding system is largely to blame for the discrepancies in facilities between rich and poor districts.
Up until the last, say, 7 years, there hadn't been a lot of data to support it. You drive around and you say, okay, I observe this district, that it's pretty bad shape. Is that because they didn't take care of it or whatever? And you go to a wealthy district and say, oh yeah, we expect that in Palo Alto. But the fact is that it's the system of sharing and the system of depending on property tax wealth to produce the facilities that districts have. That's the problem. It's not any individual flaw. And 50 years ago, the state dealt with the issue of funding schools by property taxes with the Serrano decisions in the 1970s that said as far as operating your schools, you can't rely on the property tax. It's just inequitable. It violates students' constitutional right to an equal opportunity for an education. And that's why it led eventually to the local control funding formula. But that just covers operating expenses. The Serrano decisions didn't get into facilities.
What is the lawsuit seeking, John?
The lawsuit is seeking only at this point is to have a judge declare this as an unconstitutional violation of kids' rights, and therefore legislature, state leaders fix it. Now, there are other ideas out there. Public advocates who brought the suit, they have looked at various formulas. The Center for Cities and Schools said, all right, well, what would it be if it were 80% funded for poor districts, and if you're rich, you get, instead of 60%, maybe you get 20%. Would that solve the problem? Public advocates wanted 95% state funding, down to 5% for the richest districts. But there's a lot of compromise and settling to do, but there are lots of ideas. You don't even need bonds. Maybe that should come out of a state general fund instead of floating bonds. One of the things I want to look into, Zadie, is what other states have done, because California is well behind other states in terms of facilities. Other people look at California and say, boy, you have a really progressive system of funding the operations of your schools, but California is very regressive in terms of its facilities.
Thank you so much, John.
Thanks for asking, Zadie.
Miliani Rodriguez is excited about the lawsuit. She says she didn't hesitate to be the plaintiff the case is named for.
I said yes right away. This is the opportunity that I have to actually get my voice out there.
And she says she's not just speaking out for herself, but for all the other students, teachers, and coaches in her school and beyond. Because when she met other plaintiffs, she realized that these problems went far beyond Coachella Valley.
Hearing their stories, how similar we all are, and we're from different districts. Why is there so many issues everywhere when we could be helping these districts?
She says students deserve classrooms that help them dream, not just survive the school day, that say to every student, you matter.
I hope everything goes well so that way we can get proper funding and modernize all these schools so that way the students can have the proper learning that they need.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Education Beat, getting to the heart of California schools, a production of EdSource. You can find a link to John's story in our podcast notes and at edsource.org. Our producer is Kobe McDonald. Special thanks to our guest, Miliani Rodriguez, and to reporter and editor-at-large, John Fensterwald. Our theme music is from Blue Dot Sessions. This episode was brought to you by the S.H. Cowell Foundation. I'm Zadie Stavely. Join us next week and subscribe so you won't miss an episode.